Hey, good day, everybody. Welcome back to Rocky Mountain Readings, where last week I kind of got snagged in the great Facebook meta blackout happened last Tuesday. But Monday we finished off our book, Providence and Power, 10 Portraits in Jewish Statesmanship by Rabbi Mirwai Soloveitchik. Very, very interesting book. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it, but I tried to log in on Tuesday morning about 10 or 15 minutes after the blackout happened, and I could not get into my Facebook channel, which is where I have the connected links to broadcast on the Noahide World Center. Nonetheless, I tried so many times to log in. I guess it had went into security lockdown. So I even went as far as setting up a new Facebook page with my name, and many people have friended me already, but the point is I better have a backup just in case, but then I need permissions from the Noahide World Center to be able to broadcast and have to have connections with a bunch of others that I advertise on and whatnot. But nonetheless, by Wednesday, I was able to get in, and the last broadcast I did was with Hashi Skobak. We did our meditation class, but we finished this book last week, Providence and Power, and so I was looking for a new book, and so I thought today we'll stay with the historical theme, and we're going to discuss a short book called The Bar Kokhba Revolt, a captivating guide to the Third Jewish-Roman War and its impact on ancient Rome and Jewish history. And it's by a group called Captivating History, who tries to tell the stories in a way that brings them alive. So we hope that you guys enjoy this. So, yeah, let's just jump right in. And please make sure you like the video and, enjoy learning about the Bar Kokhba Revolt. From my understanding, happened around 132 to 135 A.D., and it was kind of the last ditch effort before the full Jewish dispersion around the planet. So let's jump right in and hear what the book has to say. It's got good recommendations on Amazon anyways. Okay, introduction. When we talk about Jewish history today, people mainly focus on the turbulent 20th century. During this time, the Jewish people suffered greatly throughout the Holocaust of the Second World War, then went on to take part in one of the longest conflicts of the contemporary era, the Arab-Israeli conflict. These topics grab our attention because we are much closer to them. However, these events often obscure our vision of the past, eclipsing the majority of Jewish history, which started more than 3,000 years ago. In the rare cases when people look further back, they tend to focus on the smaller Jewish enclaves living in various countries throughout the history, or on the heavily romanticized Babylonian exile or the great Jewish revolt against the Roman rule of Judea. Of course, these are undeniably important for grasping all the adversity, suffering, and grief that the Jews have gone through. However, one of the topics that is much less talked about but remains equally important is the Bar Kokhba Revolt. As we read Rabbi Akiva a couple books ago, it was Akiva that really supported Bar Kokhba. For a long time, this final rebellious act of the defiant Jewish population in Judea, struggling against one of the most powerful empires of antiquity, remained relatively unknown. It lacked the romantic nature of the great Jewish revolt when the temple was destroyed, making it less attractive for modern researchers. Similarly, for ancient writers, especially Roman ones, it seemed it was nothing more than just a blip on the historical radar. It was just one of the many rebellions Rome faced at the time. Simultaneously, for many Jews, past and present, it remained a regrettable moment, something that many would rather not talk about. It is that aspect of the revolt that makes it important and why we should even bother learning about it. The Bar Kokhba Revolt was the final catalyst that transformed Jewish history. It was a loss so terrible that it changed Judaism as a faith, altered the demographic landscape of Judea, crushed the Jewish fighting spirit, and ultimately decided the future of Jewish people. In a way, it was the true beginning of the Jewish exile from Israel, one that would last until the modern era. As such, this makes it pivotal in not only Jewish history, but also the history of the world. Learning about it can teach us many important historical lessons and also help us understand the present world we live in. Excellent. I like the introduction. Chapter 1, Jewish Origins and First Contact with the Romans. Before delving into the final revolt of ancient Jews, it's important to give a brief outline of their history before the Romans arrived. It is important to understand Jewish culture and the ties the ancient Hebrews with their customs and lands. However, it is important to note that for many of these stories, the only historical source is the Hebrew Bible, making it hard to discern fact from fiction. Furthermore, scarce archaeological evidence and other written sources sometimes diverge from the religious scriptures, rewriting the history of the early Israelites in a slightly different way than in the Hebrew Bible. For some, this may be seen as offensive or some kind of transgression. If this book arouses similar feelings, it is important to note that it is not intentional and that the sole goal of this guide is to present our past as accurately as possible. Interesting. Paintings depicting Moses leading the Jews out of Egypt through the Red Sea, holding the Ten Commandments. Yeah, I've been reading in Rebbe Nachman. They were as wide as they were high, and they were thick as well. And they had engravings that went all the way through. It was a unique form of upper dimensional writing, and yet the pass-through did not show the reverse on the back side. It read the same on both sides, so it's a geometrical configuration. Traditional histories of the Jewish people most commonly begin with the story of the Exodus, one of the most famous biblical tales. In short, it talks about a group of Israelites living in Egypt who were enslaved at some point. Moses delivered them to freedom by leading them through the Sinai Desert into what would become their home in what is today Israel. I think we can go back to Abraham. In an important part of their salvation is the form bond between the Israelites and Yahweh, the deity they worshipped. According to this tradition, Yahweh would protect them as the chosen people as long as they worshipped only him and obeyed his law, the famous Ten Commandments. That's the whole, all of his commandments, the 613. Thus, the Exodus is the Genesis story of the Jewish people, explaining both how their religion and nation came into existence. As such, it was long held as an unequivocal truth, yet modern scholars tend to discard it as nothing more than a myth. According to various researchers, there is no credible archaeological data to support the Israelite migration from Egypt, especially in numbers from the Exodus legend. I've always had difficulty with the numbers myself. It comes down to the word, Aleph, where it says 600 Aleph left, and they translate that as 600,000 in tradition, men with women and children besides, but the term also can be used for clans, right? So 600 clans could be maybe as few as 25,000 people. Still mass numbers for sure. But I like Dr. David Rawls' research into the life of Joseph in Egypt and the evidence that he shows for the house of Egypt, and there's still a dam area there, a reservoir named after Joseph, and if you read the story correctly about how he saved the land during the lean times, it says they did not plant or sow. They did not sow or harvest during the lean times, and the question comes to light about, even if you're going through a drought, you could still sow, right? You got to think about it. But when the scripture says they didn't sow, the historians, he looks at it as they didn't so because they couldn't, and it had to do with flooding of the plains. And what Joseph did during the great years was build a reservoir to hold water, so overflow, so it didn't flood for a number of years, allowing access to water to continue crops. But when it did overflow and flood farms, you can't sow because it's just, you're in swamp, right? Anyways, I think he's pulled out some wonderful archaeological material. But despite that, many still think that there is a strong link between the formation of the Israelite people and Egypt. There were several smaller ancient Semitic people groups present in Egypt in the 13th and 12th century BCE. Also, the time Egypt occasionally ruled over Canaan, the region that covered the Mediterranean shores from Syria to Sinai. Yeah, I like his new David Rawls' new chronology, which pumps it back a couple hundred years, which I think is more suitable with the evidence. Furthermore, an Egyptian stela dated to 1208, the Merneptah stela, mentions Israel as a cultural entity, though more akin to an ethnic group rather than an organized state. So it really comes down to formation and what, kind of like we have the Palestinians claiming the land today, yet they were never a recognized country. What makes a country and who says what's a country? Yeah. Thus, while most scholars today argue that the Israelites were indigenous to the region of the Dead Sea and the River Jordan, there is a strong possibility that Egypt influenced their culture and collective memory during the time they were forming. Some theorize that a period of oppressive Egyptian rule formed the idea of captivity, while others suggest that some of the already enslaved Semitic groups from Egypt managed to escape in small numbers and mix with the Israelites. Yeah, the picture, archaeology is a weird science in the sense that you can't factually, it's not like rewinding a clock 100%, right? You're picking bits and pieces and trying to formulate the overall picture. However, despite the Egyptian influence from the language of the culture of the Israelites, it is very clear that they were part of the Canaan people as one of their subgroups. Further testimony to that is the fact that they shared the same religious system. According to modern scholars and archaeological evidence, the early Israelites weren't monotheistic but worshipped the same pantheon of gods as the other Canaanites, with Yahweh just being one of them. I don't hold that true. I think, when you follow it as they teach, all the way back to Abraham, there's definitive links to the one true God. Furthermore, some have claimed that the name Israel comes from the name of another Canaanite god, El, although this seems to be debatable, as later on El became a generic term meaning God. Yeah, but the term Israel comes from Jacob having his name changed. Yeah, even the Bible contains traces of struggles between Israelites who were in favor of worshiping only Yahweh and a group that was in favor of a large pantheon. One thing, no doubt archaeologically, is that Jerusalem existed in the 10th century as a city, and the story that King David won the city from the Jebusites holds merit for sure archaeologically. Scholars doubt that the transfer to monotheism took place as described in the Holy Scripture. Got to remember, you're dealing with a different era when books weren't books. They were scrolls, and not everybody could read or write, and not everybody had access to material. And the way things were gathered, Rabbi Moshe Shulman did a wonderful session on our last Noahide Path group that went from the rabbinic tradition from Moses. He took it all the way to the 11th century, and next weekend we're going to continue on from the 11th century. Interesting material for sure. Instead, they think it was a slow process in which Yahweh worshippers merged together features of several other gods like Baal and the already mentioned El into their primary deity. Simultaneously, they began ousting separate veneration of those absorbed gods. I think there's more definite. Um, it wasn't until the Great Assembly after the Babylonian exile that you had the religion form into a more ritualistic, religious setting. Prior to that, a lot of the people didn't understand the full scope of the laws and the cohesiveness of them as a people, for sure. But the transfer from of the Torah, especially the oral Torah from Moses to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. So when you get prior to 500 BC to the time of Moses, you're dealing with ancient antiquity, and of course there's no definitive archaeological remains, but a lot of scattered towns and people trying to understand the area in which they lived. And when you're dealing with simple folks, it takes a lot for them to understand even what religious worship is. And there was a mingling for sure in that area of a lot of phony belief systems. Like you have the what's her name, Jezebel, and during the time of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, the story in Kings, just phenomenal filler in that time. Yeah, additional research shows that other tribes in the region follow a similar path of development, leading to the rise of nation states in the Levant in the 9th century BC, all with their own distinct primary deities. Overall, this indicates that the Israelites weren't monotheistic from the beginning. I wouldn't say when he says Israelites, he's talking about what's going on in the area. However, by then, the cultural ties between the Israelites and Yahweh were inseparable, linking him to the story of the Exodus. According to the Jewish tradition, when God chose the Israelites as the chosen people, he had also promised them land. The biblical accounts of the so-called Promised Land's extent vary, but it is largely thought to include modern-day Israel and Lebanon. According to biblical mythology, the Israelites were awarded their Promised Land when they conquered other Canaanite Israel tribes in the mid-11th century, creating the Kingdom of Israel, or the United Monarchy. It lasted until the late 10th century BC, and it was ruled by the famous mythical kings, including David and Solomon. I mean, there's no denying the existence of David and Solomon. There's enough archaeological proof. Yeah. Around 930, 920, it separated into the northern kingdom or the kingdom of Samaria, and the southern kingdom or kingdom of Judah, also spelled Judea, when some tribes rebelled against the rule of Solomon's heir. The historicity of these events is also hotly debated, with some claiming they are pure fiction and others supporting the scriptures. Some archaeological evidence does support the notion of an organized Israeli state existing at the time, but its extent and exact history remain obscured. Most likely, the biblical stories were inspired by real events, though they were enriched to serve a religious narrative. I mean, yeah, you don't want to get lost in the academic frame of things solely. I recommend, hear the stories as they're told in the Bible through the narrative of a rabbi's understanding of their oral tradition. It just wakes up and comes alive in the mind for sure. That was a map of the northern borders and the southern. Yeah. After that, there was definitively clear that the northern kings. There was several decades or 100 years where they weren't allowed to access to the temple, and they refused to let their own citizens in the north go down to perform religious ceremonies in Jerusalem, and a lot of that played into the fact of them, looking for spiritual fulfillment in other places. And inevitably the Northern Kingdom was dispersed, and those are considered the 10 lost tribes. Yeah, but one of the most important biblical stories of that era is the construction of Solomon's temple, which held the Ark of the Covenant. According to the Holy Scriptures, it became the central place of worship and assembly of the Israelites. It was located in Jerusalem, which became Israel's capital during David's rule. Once again, the historicity of the biblical tales is questionable, and no archaeological excavations of the supposed location of Solomon's temple are allowed for political and religious reasons. Most scholars do agree that it likely existed, but there you go. They do agree it likely existed, but that it may have been built later when Jerusalem became a more populous and thriving city. However, even those estimates vary from the mid-9th to the late 7th century BCE. Yet, for the purpose of this guide, this is less relevant. The main point is that the Israelites formed a special bond with the central temple, which highlighted both their devotion to Yahweh and their connection with the Promised Land. Unfortunately for them, that connection was to be severed after the united monarchy split. Samaria in the north began to prosper and went through urban development. In contrast, Judah and the south remained relatively undeveloped and sparsely populated. Yeah, the Judea wilderness, the southern part, was always subject to drought and highly susceptible to, whereas the north was a little more lush. According to the biblical narrative, the two kingdoms continued to clash for a while after their split, but made peace in the late 9th century BCE. Just prior to the coming of Elijah. However, it's vital to keep in mind that their grandeur attested in the holy texts is misleading. I wouldn't say it's misleading, it's directing in a certain way, as they were relatively small and weak compared to the Egyptian in the west and the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the east. Yeah, they were not considered a superpower in the region, unlike, say, Assyria or Egypt. But if you go back, the notion that the United Kingdom under Solomon was world power, you've got a big task to try to prove that. The latter proved to be especially dangerous as their might was quickly expanding. By the late 8th century, the Assyrians were poised to get mixed in with the Israelite squabbles. According to the biblical narrative, when Judah was once again threatened by Samaria, its king asked the Assyrians for help in return for tribute. The Assyrians obliged, and the northern kingdom was sacked. Parts of its territory were then annexed. A few years later, the new Assyrian king came back to Samaria and completely conquered it around 720. That's where the around 720 is when you had the kingdom of Israel was. The 10 tribes were taken away. Both the Assyrian records and the biblical texts tell us that part of the Israelite population of Samaria was taken to Assyria. However, these deportations weren't as comprehensive as earlier scholars assumed. It was the king's practice. Sennacherib at that time, that was his MO. He would uproot them and move them into an area that he controlled. And that's the way he ruled, and it worked for a period for the Assyrians. Most of the Israelites remained where they lived, while many also fled south to Judea. That influx of population partially caused the growth of the southern kingdom, allowing Jerusalem to expand and become a more important trading center. However, Judah remained only partially independent as a tribute state of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The southern Israelites managed to regain their freedom around 640 BC when the Assyrian state began to crumble. In the meantime, Egypt was still recovering from its own struggles against the Mesopotamian Empire. These were the last breaths of peace for Judah, as the entire region became involved in a series of clashes by 610. This is just prior to Nebuchadnezzar. On the one side were the Egyptians and Assyrians, and on the other side were the Babylonians, who were rebuilding their state after being subjugated by the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The southern kingdom decided to side with the Babylonians, presuming that the other side was weakened. Indeed, the Babylonians managed to defeat them, but the retreating Egyptian army imposed vassalage on Judah in 608. The Israelites once again changed their allegiance within a few years when the rising Neo-Babylonian Empire defeated Egypt. This too proved to be short-lived, as by 601 BC the Babylonians had suffered a defeat, causing a series of rebellions against their rule. Judah was among the states that stopped paying tribute, adopting a pro-Egyptian stance. The Babylonians recovered from the chaos and descended upon the southern kingdom in retribution, conquering Jerusalem in 597. The city was plundered, and part of its population was deported to Babylon. Now we're getting close to the time of Jeremiah for sure. Judah once more became a vassal state. However, the Israelites again rebelled against foreign rule in 589, prompting a decisive Babylonian response. Jerusalem was besieged, and it was overrun by 586. The city was plundered and razed to the ground. Solomon's temple shared the same fate. And this is, Nebuchadnezzar. The kingdom of Judah was now fully subjugated, with its elites deported along with many other Israelites. Many were dead from the wars or seeking refuge in surrounding regions. It marked the end of the so-called Davidic kingship of the Israelites. After that period, there's never been a king of the Davidic lineup since. But that's where the Bible holds true and built into the Jewish messianic promises. Religious texts offer us the tale of the great destruction and suffering of the exiled population. However, archaeology and other accounts paint a different story. According to scholars, no more than 25% of the Judean population was deported, with only Jerusalem suffering massive destruction. Archaeological evidence suggests that the majority of settlements in Judah remained relatively undamaged. Furthermore, the deported Israelites weren't actually taken into slavery or mistreated in any similar way. They were merely repopulated in Mesopotamia, where they were allowed to practice their religion and live in larger communities. But I think it's important to note that the story of Abraham comes from the Mesopotamian region, right? And so there's commonalities in their Semitic roots of the Israelites with Mesopotamia. The story of Abraham coming out of Ur, if you've studied any Babylonian or Sumerian history, Thus, the first Jewish diaspora was formed, centered around Babylon and Mesopotamia. The Babylonian exile ended when the Persian Empire conquered Babylon in 539. Its ruler, Cyrus the Great, allowed the Israelites to return home the following year. This is leading up to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah and the formation of the Great Assembly and the rebuilding of the temple. The biblical record gives an impression that this was an act extended to the captive Israelites alone. However, scholars argue that the Persians allowed captives of all nationalities to return home. Nevertheless, the majority decided to stay in Babylon and Mesopotamia, as they had formed their new communities there. This created new divisions between the Jews, especially in regard to those who were the true chosen people. According to some, only the ones who went through the Babylonian exile were deemed genuine. And this is where you've got Ezra listing the names of families. Others thought there shouldn't be any difference. That was the Sumerians. Then came the issue of those who returned to Israel and those who remained in Mesopotamia. The biblical tale revolves around the returned exiles, making them the victors in this religious reshaping of Judaism. However, this plays a less important role to the actual restructuring of Jewish dogma and beliefs. The shock of being displaced and losing connection to their homeland and people prompted the Israelites to gather their religious texts, which became the basis of their faith and national identity. It's hard to pinpoint the exact date, but most scholars agree that the Hebrew Bible, or at least its core, was formed during the 5th century BCE. You had Ezra and Nehemiah and the Great Assembly, the last of the remaining prophets who were passed on their oral tradition, knew exactly what to piece together. Parts were gathered from the older texts and tales, I wouldn't say that, while some other portions were written as additions. They compiled, yeah, for sure. With that, the Jews standardized their rituals, traditions, and beliefs. This is as is given to the authorities, the leadership in Jewish tradition. They have that ability granted from above to be able to do such. This became the foundation of modern Judaism, and we don't start to see archaeologically the formation of synagogues per se until about the 3rd century BCE, and these still archaeologically exist. But Jewish life prior to that, much more difficult to concrete pen out for sure. Kind of like when you think of going all the way back, say, to the time of the judges. I mean, what were communities like? You're dealing with small Bedouin type towns that were probably just a number of families, trying to protect an area and farm and raise cattle. Yet it is important to note that this wasn't a quick and easy transition. In the 5th century, as well as in many centuries later, the Hebrew Bible represented only a small fraction of the Israelite community as a whole. Its rise to dominance was a slow and lengthy process. Yeah, there was several hundred years for sure. Regardless, this transformation was crucial. On a theological scale, it marked the final transition to monotheism. I think final transition to traceable monotheism. In the previous centuries, the Israelites worshiped only Yahweh, but they didn't negate the existence of other gods. They just called them idols, yeah. Thus, their faith was either a monolatry, accepting the existence of other gods while worshiping only one, or henotheism, with Yahweh being singled out as the supreme God while not denying the presence of lower deities. Yet by the 5th century, Judaism accepted that only one God existed, with others being false idols. These ideas were reinforced by the returning exiles, who also built upon the idea of the Jews being the chosen people and Israel the chosen community, ideas that were favored by Yahweh. Both of these ideas created a degree of separation between the returning Jews and those who weren't deported. It's a question of coming to an understanding of national identity, adding a strong genealogical aspect to Judaism. Additionally, these ideas allowed the Jews to exclude other Israelite communities like Samaritans from their proper faith. When they returned from their exile, you had Samaritans trying to make claims of religious rights in that region, where the rabbis held that only certain things were to be done within Jerusalem. The Babylonian exile and the fall of the Davidic line also added the idea of messianism to Judaism. I wouldn't say it added it, but it definitely became more prominent in expectation for sure. This was the belief that a single human king, a representative of Yahweh, would lead the Jews to reclaim their freedom and control over the promised land, which would then be purified from foreign and impure influences. Such ideas fostered resistance to outside rule, no matter how benign it was. The Persian rule was most certainly on the more benevolent side, as they made Judea, officially Yehud, almost more of a client state than a true province of the empire. As long as the Jews paid their taxes and tributes, the Persians left them largely alone. Not only that, but their emperors supported and financed the reconstruction of Solomon's temple, which everybody agrees on, which became known as the Second Temple. Its construction was finished around 516 BC. I think, according to Jewish sources, it's much later than that. And it once again became the center of Jewish religion and ceremonies. This revived the importance of the high priest, while the Jewish kings began to lose their importance. In other words, they didn't reinstate Davidic dynasty. They didn't have the authority based on their peace treaties with the Assyrians or the Persians. Were permitted to set up a kingship. So this is where you get a transition from monarchy to more provincial order. This revived the importance of the high priests, while the Jewish kings began to lose their importance. It's time under that sort of living for sure. The latter slowly descended into being governors and civic representatives. You had the loss of the prophets, the source of the prophets. The high priest became the principal authority in Judea, making it a form of theocracy, though it was still subjugated to Persian rule. In the end, the Persian leniency towards the Jews brought them the loyalty of Judea, with no major uprisings being recorded during their roughly 200-year-long rule. Nevertheless, the region of what was once the southern kingdom remained undeveloped or underdeveloped. Jerusalem, despite the rebuilt temple, was only a small settlement with a couple thousand people living in it. In comparison, the former northern kingdom was flourishing with a number of Samaritans and other Canaanites, whom the Bible calls the improper Israelites, outnumbering the proper Jews. It's worth noting that those other Israelites also worshipped Yahweh, but were excluded by the Jews in society, who went so far as to ban mixed marriages with them. All in all, the Jews in Judea consolidated their religion and nationality during the Persian reign. That's where we get closer to validatable history, while the diaspora continued to grow and expand across the empire, reaching Egypt and Syria. The relative peace and prosperity of Judea were offset with the arrival of Alexander the Great, who conquered the entire Persian Empire around 330 BC. And the Hebrew history testifies that one of the last great members of the Great Assembly, Shimon Hatzadik, actually greeted Alexander the Great when he came to Jerusalem around 332. But his reign was short. He died young, as he died in 323, bringing an end to a calm period in the Levant. Alexander's empire disintegrated in the matter of years, with the most powerful successors being Ptolemaic Egypt and the Seleucid Syria. Yeah, this is where we get into history for sure. These two states went on to wage several wars over the dominion of the Levant, including Judea. At first, Egypt conquered Judea, doing so around 320. It retained control over the region for more than a century, though many campaigns between the Ptolemaics and the Seleucids were fought across the Levant. Under Egyptian reign, Jews remained relatively satisfied, as the Ptolemaic pharaohs allowed them similar liberties as under the Persians. However, by the late 3rd century BC, the Ptolemaic rulers installed new taxes and also brought unwarranted Hellenistic influences in their efforts to reinforce the region against the Seleucids. Yeah, this is where you had, by the late 3rd century, you had the rise of, what was that religion that Greece tried to install in Egypt? It'll come to me. A specific cult that they tried to add Greek mind or Greek thinking over Egyptian religion. They tried to conquer it religiously to sway the minds of the people. What was that called? That was... Sorry, folks, looking something up. Serapis, the Serapis cult. The Greeks instituted the Serapis cult to try to engulf all the thousands of years of Egyptian religion. And this is a really, really, really big turning point, solely because if you don't understand the turning point, no, Serapis cult, Dan. Yeah, the Serapis cult was critical because it's a deliberate attempt to conquer a people with an ideology rather than a military. And and this is generally what Christianity tried to do with the Romans tried to do with Christianity over the Judaic region, a very similar fashion. But the Serapis cult was, attacking the ancient Egyptian religion, which was very, very multi-deity ideology. But so it's a different approach. But the point is, it's a tactic. This caused some of the Judeans to question their loyalty to Egypt and think about allegiances to Syria. By 198, Judea had been conquered by the Seleucids, who initially retained the lenient policy towards the Jews. They were allowed to retain their customs and societal organizations. However, this changed around 175 BC when Antiochus IV Epiphanes became the Seleucid king. He sought to consolidate the vast state by creating a more homogeneous culture and religious society based on Hellenistic ideals. Which is what the Serapis cult tried to do in Egypt. He even promoted Zeus as the central deity of the kingdom and banned some local ceremonial practices. For example, the Jews were forbidden from circumcision, which the Hellenistic culture saw as an unnecessary scarring of the human body. So it's a clash of ideology. Of course, this almost immediately outraged the Jewish populations because circumcision is part of the covenant, goes all the way back to Abraham. It outraged the Jewish population in Judaism. It's about the whole covenant's tied with circumcision, causing an open rebellion in 167 BC. It became known as the Maccabean Revolt, named after its leader, Judah Maccabee, who came from the priestly Hasmonean dynasty. However, it is vital to note that the Seleucids weren't fully oppressive in the matter. Many Jews already accepted Hellenistic influences in culture, building gymnasiums and participating in Greek games. This led some scholars to argue that the revolt wasn't aimed against the Seleucids, but against the Hellenized Jews, while the central government merely interfered to restore peace in one of its own provinces. This is just the nature of when people try to lord over others. It's not intended by design. Regardless, the Jewish struggle continued for roughly 6 years. The Hasmonean forces employed guerrilla tactics and managed to inflict several losses on the Seleucids, who were stretched on several other fronts. In 164, the rebels took control of Jerusalem, ritually cleansing the Second Temple. An occasion of such importance that its celebration is known as Hanukkah was included as a permanent commemoration of the Jewish calendar. Of no less importance was the growing interference with the Roman Republic, which began spreading its influence on the Eastern Mediterranean. And this is where you have the melding of Greco-Roman culture, even though they are distinct empires, the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. The reality is that they were one culture, very similar in culture, parallels. The Roman state, whose founding is traditionally dated to 753 BC, began to expand into Greece in the late 3rd century, making the Seleucid Empire one of its main adversaries at the time. Thus, Rome offered support to all the Seleucids' enemies including Judea and Egypt. These are key points. The Romans ordered to mediate between the Jews and the Seleucids, even forming an alliance with the former. However, nothing came out of it. By 160 BCE, the revolt died out after the death of Judah. Yes, and we read in that one book some of that family continuing right up to that, or no, it was in our last book where it talked about Shlom Sion, about 100 years after that period, just before Roman takeover. Despite the rebellion losing its momentum, the Jews remained restless and continuously challenged the Seleucid reign. Over the next 2 decades, they continued their struggle against the Seleucids. They were led by Jonathan Hasmonean, Judah's brother and heir, who proved to be more patient and diplomatic savvy. Initially, he came to terms with the central government, consolidating both his command as well as the unity of the Jews. At the same time, he awaited for an opportunity to strike. It arrived in 152 BC, when the Seleucid Empire was engulfed in civil war. Initially, the reigning Seleucid king approached Jonathan asking for Jewish support, yet Alexander Balas, the pretender to the throne, countered with a better offer. If he won, the Jews would gain wider autonomy. With Jonathan acting as religious and civil leader, coincidentally, Rome also backed the pretender, making the Jews and Romans indirect allies. Very important, yeah. Rome also backed the pretender, making the Jews and Romans indirect allies. In 150, the coalition and the pretender had won, and Judea was transformed into an autonomous vassal state. However, the Seleucid Empire found no peace afterwards. It wasn't long before new claimants rose to challenge the throne, continuing the civil war. Jonathan remained faithful to Alexander until the Seleucid ruler was assassinated in 145. In the ensuing years, Judea shifted alliances several times, as none of the changing sides in the Seleucid civil war proved to be trustworthy allies. And this is because there was no peace in the land, there was no providence, and no Davidic king. In the process, Jonathan also expanded Jewish control by annexing 3 districts in southern Samaria. By then, Jonathan realized that Judean independence was possible only through a combination of diplomacy and force. He reached out once again to Rome, asking for an alliance, but he was murdered in 142 before it could come to fruition. Nevertheless, his brother and heir Simon Hasmonean continued in his footsteps. The new high priest backed the winning side in the civil war in return for guarantee of Judean independence. Thus, by 141 BC, Judea had once again become an autonomous state whose status was recognized by the Roman Senate through another treaty. So they let Roman hands get in there because of their problems with the Greeks. You can just see that transition from Greek rule to Roman rule. After several centuries of occupations and foreign rule, it seemed that the Hasmoneans finally managed to restore the chosen land to the chosen people. Yet the wheel of history rarely treads such a clear path. Chapter 2, From Allies to Enemies and Subjugation. In the mid-2nd century BC, relations between the Romans and Jews were friendly, and they even signaled an alliance pact in which the former acted as patrons of the latter. On paper, it seemed like fertile ground for further strengthening their bonds. Yet in reality, the two nations had only one thing in common: the Seleucids as their enemies. Furthermore, relying on Roman protection was something that Judea would pay for dearly in the end. The first signs of trouble came several years after Judea's independence was confirmed. Another change on the Seleucid throne and the end of the civil war allowed the Seleucid central government to reject the agreement struck with Simon Hasmonean. Around 135, the Seleucid king demanded that he either return the lands conquered by the Jews outside of Judea proper or pay a hefty tribute as compensation. Furthermore, the Seleucid garrison was to be stationed in Jerusalem, reverting Judea to a merely semi-autonomous vassal state. Simon refused, and the Seleucids marched to war. However, Simon was murdered by his overly ambitious son-in-law, Ptolemy, before he could deal with the invaders. His son and heir, John Hyrcanus, managed to save the throne for the Hasmonean dynasty, but in 134, Jerusalem was besieged, and Jerusalem was forced to plead for peace, considering the Jewish position was hopeless. The Seleucid terms were relatively mild. A garrison was stationed in Jerusalem. Judea had to pay the invaders an indemnity, and they had give hostages as insurances. Finally, John had to pay an annual tribute for the lands the Seleucids deemed were theirs, but under Judean control. In essence, Judea became a self-autonomous vassal state anyways. And here's a couple of coins from around that era. The Seleucid incursion was by all means an act worthy of Roman intervention had the Senate wanted to act. The vague wording of the alliance treaty left Rome's hands free from intervening, and the Senate chose to remain inactive, doing nothing to alleviate the Jewish plight. Nevertheless, the existence of the signed pact likely influenced the Seleucids' mild terms, at least somewhat. It is more than likely that they didn't want to antagonize the Romans more than necessary, as the treaty allowed them to intervene as they saw fit. As the Seleucids were also fighting against the Parthians in the east, at the same time, the war with Rome would be devastating. That same war also influenced the Seleucids' leniency towards Judea. The Seleucids wanted some kind of rapprochement with the Jews, as it would secure their rear from further disturbances. Despite that, John had no intention to remain an obedient Seleucid subject. While his liege fought in the east, he immediately started rebuilding his army, employing both Jewish troops and foreign mercenaries. All he needed was an opportunity to act. Circumstances soon realigned in John's favor. In 129, the Seleucid king was killed in the battle with the Parthians, leaving two contenders to his throne to fight amongst themselves. Another civil war ravaged the Hellenistic kingdom for almost 20 years, with no less than 4 successful pretenders exchanging places on the throne. Additionally, the Seleucids continuously faced the Parthian threat, as well as periodical Egyptian hostilities. At first, John was satisfied with merely regaining independence, as neither of the claimants had enough strength to force Judea under Seleucid rule. However, by 113 BC, the Jews were certain that their former masters were in a weakened position, allowing them to expand their state outside of Judea proper. The first target was Samaria, which fell easily to the Judean mercenary army. In trying to secure the conquest, John immediately turned to Rome, asking for recognition of the Jewish claims. Rome implicitly agreed. The Senate acknowledged the Judean rights on the province, but did not expressly recognize its legitimacy, all the while renewing the previous alliance treaties. Now, these are things that really tell legitimate tale to Israel's right to the land that the Palestinians today argue over. When you've got documents that go back to 113 BC. However, it was soon clear that the Romans weren't ready to act on their words. The Samaritans soon asked the Seleucids for assistance. Samaritans, yeah. So you've got like civil war split factions who were eager to comply. While John fought them, he asked Rome for assistance. In response, the Senate sent a letter asking the Seleucid king to return captured cities and not to harm the Jews, who were Roman allies. However, there were no threats or ultimatums, making them nothing more than worthless words on a piece of parchment. Luckily for John, the Seleucid army was stretched across various battlefields, and the Judean forces were able to defeat the small contingents sent against them. In the following years, they completed their conquest of Samaria, destroying the Samaritan temple to Yahweh in the process. For the Jews, only one temple to God could exist, the one in Jerusalem. It's very important. This proved to be the final break between the two Israelite nations. John also conquered Edom, also known as Idumea, the south region of Judea, as well as parts of the Transjordan region on the northern shores of the Dead Sea. Through these wars, John more than doubled the size of the Judean state, giving it access to the Mediterranean coast once again. However, more importantly, John adopted a policy of imposing Jewish customs and Judaism on the non-Jewish people under his reign. And to make it this is where you get a lot of this ethno-religious identity for the Jewish people, most notably the Edomites. This would play a crucial role in the further development of Jewish history, but it also helped cement John's status in Judea, as most of the religious elites and common citizens praised his actions. Yeah, and a lot of this was surrounding the allies with the Pharisees and the dawning of the Sadducees, who were considered to be nobles just trying to exert control, but the Pharisees were considered the religion of the people. There's the Hasmonean kingdom, how broken up it would have been, the land. Just because it was broken, it doesn't mean it wasn't legitimate. Oh, for sure, Dan. Yeah, for sure. But I mean, I love the ancient history because it strengthens the Israeli position, but also to understand the idea of how the religion and its tradition has genuine roots. If you don't get the sources from their oral tradition, and you're only left with the archaeological picture, it's blotchy. And if you're one of those people that need tangible evidence in front of you alone before you can have any belief structure, it can be daunting for sure. However, while most Jews were satisfied with the expansion of their state and religion, there was a growing division among them about the future of both. On one side were the Sadducees, whose name possibly comes from the Hebrew word meaning to be right or just. This faction was more concerned about the national state. Yeah, they were nobles and landowners, and they wanted to protect their estates, as they wanted to merge cosmopolitan influences with traditional heritage of their religion. Their adversaries were the Pharisees, or separatists. I wouldn't say separatists, they're common for the people, a group centered around traditionalists and priests. Yeah. They advocated against Hellenistic influences and more on religion than on the state of the nation. That's what the Pharisees did. Many of them advocated the separation of religious and civic authorities held by the Hasmoneans, as they feared politics would distort the proper religion. Furthermore, they believed that the state existed only to protect and facilitate the Judaic religious life. John tried to keep both parties satisfied, but he naturally leaned closer to the Sadducees. Nevertheless, he decided to compromise with the Pharisees posthumously. Instead of giving up his priestly title while he was still alive, John bequeathed it in his will to his eldest son, Judah Aristobulus. While his wife, and this just goes to show you, they adopted Greek names when the family was originally claim to fame was the fight against the Greek lifestyle, while his wife was to inherit his princely crown. Regardless of John's wishes, after his death in 104, Judah seized both titles for himself, imprisoning his mother and brothers to secure his reign. Furthermore, Judah tread carefully when dealing with the Pharisees, whose support grew among the commoners. Despite that, his reign was cut short. After conquering Galilee in 103, he fell ill and died, most likely from natural causes. During his short rule, Judah managed to not only expand Judea, but also proclaim himself king. That was against Jewish customs, as only the Davidic lineage could retain title. To bypass that, Judah called himself king in the non-Jewish regions of his realm. After his untimely demise, the state was left to his younger brother, Alexander Yanai, who, according to Jewish law, married his brother's childless widow. Unlike his elder brother, Alexander showed no concern with the religious and political divisions within Judea. He fully sided with the Sadducees and their Hellenized customs. The only reason he sided with the Pharisees is he needed economic support. proclaiming himself king in all the lands. Alexander's main goal was the expansion of the state and his power. His reign began rather inconspicuously as his attack on the city of Ptolemais, modern-day Acre, was thwarted due to the intervention of Cyprian kingdom, which was ruled by one of the exiled Ptolemaics. The Cyprian army landed in Palestine and began conquering Judean cities. Seeing such developments as a threat, Ptolemaic Egypt intervened, chasing off the Cyprians. According to ancient accounts, Judea was saved from subjugation when the Egyptian Jews pleaded for its salvation. Alexander continued his expansionist plans, gaining control over the Transjordan region, the area south and southeast of the Dead Sea, as well as coastal towns, most notably Gaza, with, there's a note, taking it all the way back into BC times. With that, Judea gained control over the Afro-Asian land trade routes. This brought Alexander Janus in direct conflict with the neighboring kingdom of Nabatea, centered around the famed city of Petra. Around 94 BC, the Judean forces were defeated by the Nabateans, forcing Alexander to flee to Jerusalem. Losing an army not only allowed the Nabateans to annex smaller border regions, but also caused an open uprising of the Pharisees. The traditionalists were already outraged by Alexander's Sadducean ceremony during one of the most important Jewish holidays, and they had rioted in the streets of Jerusalem in prior years. Thus, when they sensed Alexander was vulnerable, they rose in rebellion. The two opposing forces struggled for a couple of years, with the Pharisees refusing to negotiate even when Janus felt threatened enough. However, Alexander was able to gather new mercenary troops and regain the upper hand. Fearing they were to be crushed, the extremist parts of the Pharisees asked the Seleucids for assistance. They were more than willing to oblige, as they saw an opportunity to regain their control over Judea. Alexander's army was almost half the size of the Seleucid and Jewish rebel army, making his defeat in 88 BC. Yeah, we're not quite there yet, Explorer Tanakh. We're only at 88 BC. However, once the Hasmonean troops scattered to the hills, many of the Judeans realized that their treason jeopardized Jewish independence. About 6,000 Pharisee warriors switched sides, with public opinion swinging to Alexander's side. This reversal was enough for the Seleucids to withdraw, as they feared a prolonged campaign. After the Seleucids left, Janus dealt with the remainder of the Pharisees. Some were executed, while others were exiled. Their influence on Judea was almost annulled. After quelling the rebellion, Alexander returned to waging offensive wars. Further expanding Judean borders in Transjordan and Judaizing the region in the process. Jannaeus ruled and warred almost without a break for roughly 27 years, succumbing to an illness in 76 BC. In accordance with his wishes, his widow Salome Alexandria inherited the throne. This is Shlom Sion that we read about in that last book. But as a woman, she wasn't allowed to serve as the high priest. Thus, finally, the civil and religious authority in Judea was divided. So this is a very, very key pivotal point. This is where you get the Pharisees and the Sadducees seize control back of the temple service in 76. As Salome appointed her eldest son Hyrcanus as the spiritual leader. This sowed the seeds of renewed internal struggles. The new high priest was close to the Pharisees, who returned to prominence quickly after Jannaeus' death. Salome acted prudently in the face of strong opposition. She came to some political agreements with them, allowing them control of domestic matters, while she remained the unquestionable authority of foreign affairs. Nevertheless, such a deal wasn't completely satisfactory to the Pharisees, who wanted complete control. In contrast, the Sadducees felt threatened, and they turned to Salome's younger son Aristobulus for help and protection. As an ambitious person, the young prince accepted, hoping their loyalty would bring him more influence in Judean politics. Throughout this time, Rome kept moving closer to Judea. This is key. At the turn of the century, the Senate gradually began supporting the idea of eastward expansion, leading to wars in Asia Minor despite having their own internal struggles and rebellions. The Romans slowly expanded their influence towards Syria. Unfortunately for Judea, both Alexander and Ptolemy remained neutral toward Rome, leaving the old alliance treaties unrenewed. Both of them hoped to make their state strong enough to preserve its independence through force and defense. However, with internal friction rising, Judea became a target for foreign encroachment. The first to try to take advantage of the situation was the Armenian king Tigranes II, who gained control over Syria in the late 80s. Around 70 BCE, he tried to advance into Judea but was stopped when he got involved in a war against Rome as an ally of the kingdom of Pontus. The Roman legions were victorious and expelled the Armenians from Syria. However, instead of taking direct control of the region, the Senate installed a Seleucid king on the throne, making Syria a vassal puppet state for a few years. While the Romans steadily moved closer, the Jews continued to weaken themselves due to internal divisions. Arguments over the temple between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. A relative truce between the two factions lasted until Ptolemy died, Shlomsion, in 67 BC. Sadly, she was succeeded by Hyrcanus, who officially became John Hyrcanus II. However, Aristobulus felt he was more suitable for the role of king. He rebelled with the support of the aristocracy, which was the Sadducees, army generals, and the Sadducees. Hyrcanus had the support of the public and the Pharisees, somewhat, but it proved insufficient, perhaps because of his meek nature. Aristobulus achieved victory when their armies clashed, prompting the two brothers to negotiate a peace and avoid prolonged civil war. Hyrcanus accepted his defeat, leaving the royal crown to his younger brother. As for the office of the high priest, the sources are conflicted. Some state Hyrcanus retained that position, while others mention Aristobulus taking that as well. Nevertheless, the reign of Aristobulus II was far from secure. While his brother was weak and impressionable person, he quickly fell under the influence of one of his advisors, Antipater from Idumea, whose family had been governors of the province since Junius's time. As the Idumeans were Judaized mere decades before, they were generally seen as foreigners in Jerusalem. But Antipater dreamed of taking control of Judea through Hyrcanus. It is showing depictions of coins during their era. Antipater was successful in convincing Hyrcanus that his life was in danger, and they escaped to Nabatea. There, Antipater secured an alliance and attacked Aristobulus. They managed to besiege him in Jerusalem. Aristobulus only had the Romans left as allies. By then, Pompey the Great was given command of the eastern Roman frontiers. He proved more determined and capable than his predecessors. He finalized the war against Armenia and Pontus, and in the process decided how to deal with Syria and Judea as well. Pompey realized that Parthia in the east was the main threat. And that's the Iranians or the Persians. Was the main threat in that part of the Roman state, prompting him to create more secure borders protected by a buffered zone of stable client states. Thus, when Aristobulus came to him pleading for mediation and support, it created a perfect opportunity to remodel the region according to his plans. Initially, the Romans gave support to Aristobulus, while Pompey went on to transform Seleucid Syria into a Roman province around 64 BC. Then he dealt with the Nabateans, whose power had risen too much with the decline of the Seleucids. Finally, his gaze was firmly set on Judea. In dealing with Pompey, Aristobulus showed too much spunk, prompting the Roman general to finally side with his weaker brother. Antipater played no small part in this, as he continuously advocated for Hyrcanus. The younger brother wasn't about to go down without a fight, though he tried to organize a resistance, but soon realized the Roman power was too great and surrendered. Aristobulus was taken to Rome as a prisoner, but the remainder of the Sadducees, holed up in the temple, feared reprisal from the Pharisees as much as the Roman legions. Their last stand was as futile as it was bloody, resulting in Hyrcanus' victory in mid-63 BCE. However, Pompey's intervention came at great cost. Judea was stripped of all previous conquests, leaving only Judea proper and Galilee, as well as parts of Samaria and in Idumea. That's the setting of Christianity. It was roughly reverted to the size it was a century before. Furthermore, the kingship was abolished and all civic duties were given to the Roman governor of Syria, making Judea a small landlocked vassal state. Worst of all, the victory cost the Romans almost nothing. In the following years, Hyrcanus' role continued to diminish, and Antipater gradually emerged from the shadows. He quickly realized that his future was mostly tied to the Romans, so he worked hard to impress them with his loyalty. In contrast, most Jews, even Pharisees, quickly began to regret the loss of their independence. Thus, they quickly rallied behind Aristobulus' son, Alexander, in 57 BC, whose uprising against Hyrcanus was quelled only by Roman intervention. This finally prompted the Syrian governor to reform the Judean state, following the Roman practice of divide and conquer. He split the Jewish state into 5 separate districts with its own capitals and governing bodies known as Sanhedrin, or Assembly of Councils. With that, Hyrcanus lost his last traces of civic power, retaining merely a religious role in society. The reforms proved rather futile. The bust of Pompey. Initially, Antipater and Hyrcanus sided with Pompey, who fled to the east, while Caesar tried unsuccessfully to wrestle Judean support from him by sending Aristobulus and his sons there. Caesar quickly gained superiority in the conflict, with Pompey losing his life in late 48 BC. At this critical movement, Antipater switched sides along with Hyrcanus, and he even managed to save Caesar's life in Egypt. This caused some issue in 47 BC, when Caesar had to choose who governed Judea. On the one side was Aristobulus' party, headed by his own surviving son Antigonus. On the other was Antipater and Hyrcanus. Though the former had been loyal from the beginning of the Civil War, their faction was clearly more troublesome and resistant of Rome's control. Antipater had proved his loyalty to the Romans through the years. His allegiance to Pompey was justified in the eyes, since Pompey had been a legal representative of Rome. In the end, Caesar awarded Hyrcanus the inheritable title of ethnarch, leader of the Jewish people without a crown. While Antipater became his prime minister. Furthermore, Antipater was given a Roman citizenship as well as a Roman officer of procurator, meaning he was tasked with gathering taxes in Judea. In addition, Judea was awarded... so this is where the stranglehold of Rome starts to begin. In addition, Judea was awarded a single port, and the Jews across the Roman state were exempt from military service. Finally, Judea was given full local autonomy and religious freedom. Overall, this meant that Judea was now a client state rather than a province. Very important. A favorable status within what was slowly becoming the Roman Empire. For most Jews, it was acceptable. It was much as they could have hoped for in the Mediterranean world, which was undeniably Roman-dominated. Nevertheless, there were some that still disliked the subjugation, especially among the aristocracy and what remained of the Sadducees. Didn't want to pay tribute. Their dissatisfaction was only worsened by the fact that their official ruler, Hyrcanus, was nothing but a mere puppet for Antipater. He was still seen as a foreigner rather than a proper Jew, and he represented Roman governance over Judea. Yeah, so this is where we're leading up to the setting of Christianity. Nonetheless, I think that's probably a good spot to stop for today. Very, very interesting book so far. I mean, giving us background, but I think it's going to get into much more of the history, especially during the time of the first century and leading up to the Bar Kokhba Revolt, for sure. Hopefully, it paints an idealized picture. I'm not solely one who's hooked on the academic storyline of Judaic history as much as I would hear it from the rabbis, for sure. Tempo and feeling in the setting. I do like the way he stated certain things were acceptable to the Jewish people and certain were not. People always want to be able to prosper and live in a peace, and when you're dealing with invading forces, change seems to threaten a lot of people, and a lot of people do not like adapting, but nonetheless, you can see clearly the Greeks went through issue, and even during those unsettled periods you had without a Jewish king, they had, struggles and strife, and this is exactly what the Roman Empire was like. I mean, if you just look at the 3rd century AD, I think there was one year where they went through 5 Roman emperors in one year. Caesar's getting killed, and just the pursuit of power from a malevolent position, just usurp. It's terrible, but nonetheless, the wake of disaster affects everybody else in the world, and hopefully people learn from history's mistakes to make the world a better place. And I think we'll get something decent out of this book. This is a short book, so we should be able to knock it off in about 4 sessions, maybe 5. I don't know. I mean, we're already more than a quarter through, for sure. Yes, I think we can do it in 4 sessions for sure. So join me tomorrow, and we will continue with the Bar Kokhba Revolt. And hopefully we can knock this off by next Monday. And if somebody's got suggestions they want to hear read, leave it in the chat, and I will see if it's available on Kindle, and we'll go from there. So till tomorrow, have a wonderful, wonderful day, everybody. Bye for now.